If you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the business of lifelong learning, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
And I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast.
For this episode of the Leading Learning Podcast, Jeff, you had a chance to speak with Andy Steggles, who's the President and Chief Customer Officer at Higher Logic.
I did, and Andy's somebody that I've known for many years. He started out in the association world, was actually at a large association where he got involved with using communities, online communities, at first with listserv software and then just getting more complex and richer from there. And he eventually moved over to Higher Logic, where he was able to bring that experience to bear on what they are doing as a company. And just because he's been so deeply immersed in this for years, from both the practitioner side and now from the vendor side, he just has a huge amount of knowledge about how online communities work, what makes them successful, what you need to do to get them up and running, what you need to do to sustain them. So we talk about all of that in this interview, and I think you'll find some really great, useful tips from the conversation with Andy.
And plus, it makes for nice, easy listening because he has a great accent. So let's go ahead and head on over to that interview.
This is Jeff Cobb, and I am here today with Andy Steggles, who is the President and Chief Customer Officer for Higher Logic, and he is also the author of the best-selling book, Social Networking for Nonprofits. And we're going to be talking social networking and social learning today. Andy, thanks so much for taking some time to join the Leading Learning Podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Well, I know, I mentioned that you're at Higher Logic now, which is obviously a technology platform, a provider of social technology, primarily to trade and professional associations. And I know you yourself actually came from that trade and professional association background before you got into the world of being a technology provider. Can you tell us just a little bit about your background and kind of how you got from the association world to where you are now?
Yeah, sure. So back in, I think it was 99, I moved from the UK over to New York and took a job as the head of technology for RIMS, the Risk and Insurance Management Society. That was, a hybrid trade and professional association with about 10,000 individual members represented by about 4,000 companies. And while I was there, basically, if it plugged in, it kind of fell under my area. And one of the things that was very frustrating for me was the asynchronous member collaboration experience. So, in other words, we were using, like most organizations, kind of a more traditional listserv, and at the same time, I was a member of ASAE, and I was, one of my most valuable member benefits was their listserv. But again, I had the same frustrations. It was actually the same software, Lyris, at the time. And so I started thinking, if I was going to do this, what would I do to make it better? And I kept proposing and asking Lyris to build different features. But of course, it unfortunately fell on deaf ears. And just things like the digest within a digest that was continuous, and the lack of user-friendliness for the web experience, it complemented it. But the beautiful thing about the listserv, it was very proactive with the generation of emails and whatnot. So eventually, I decided to try and build a bridge on top of Lyris. That's how it kind of started, and build something that at the time was called eGroups. And before I knew it, it was a huge hit for RIMS, and the members absolutely loved it. And the idea was that, some organizations had moved to a traditional bulletin board, but the bulletin board lacked the proactivity of a listserv, right? So I thought, well, surely there's got to be a compromise where you can do the two. And so build this kind of solution. I built a solution that kind of bridged the two together. And now that it evolved into what we now know as an online community that has the proactivity of listserv and things like that.
Right. And I guess, because I can remember, being at ASAE meetings back in those days, and then hearing you talk about what you were doing at RIMS and how are you putting things together. And, you were clearly thinking ahead of the crowd at that point. But it seems like these days, everybody and their mother wants to have a community, basically, and then they want to, put up some sort of software to support it. So maybe just to start with, before we kind of dig into what it takes to actually do that successfully, how do you define community? I mean, when does a group of people actually tip into truly being a community?
We have, Rob, my business partner, and he's a co-founder of Higher Logic with himself. We have different litmus tests for this. His test is, if your audience wouldn't mind receiving one email from their peers, on a like every business day, then that's his litmus test. My litmus test is a little bit different. It's if your organization has an annual conference, an in-person annual conference, then that tells me there's a reason for the members to get together and collaborate, and it's a strong enough reason that they're prepared to go somewhere and spend actual time, usually a few days together. And the common denominator with both of those tests is, it's a group of people with a common interest that are compelled enough to want to collaborate.
Right.
But there's different levels of that, and I'll give you the example with Comcast, right? Where if my internet's down, I have an interest. It is a common interest with other people who have got the same issue with Comcast. I might go to their online forum and try and find a solution or ask a question, but I would never want to go to a Comcast conference, right? Or I certainly wouldn't want to get an email every day from them, because really it's not helping me with my profession or my career. It's not business. It's more consumer. So in a nutshell, a group of people with a common interest, a strong common interest, from a professional or career, perspective.
And so let's say that you've got a group that meets that litmus test, whether more yours or Rob's, but there is that compelling interest that's pulling them together. I'm sure this is a question you get all the time, but where do you go from there? I mean, what are the most essential steps for actually getting an online community up and started successfully?
Well, the first thing is normally when somebody comes to us, an organization comes to us, they have kind of one or two things in mind. But as other key staff within the organization start understanding the potential of community, whether it's advocacy or chapter relations or the education or the learning department, whatever department is, there's an application from the community perspective. And so the problem is organizations tend to be pulled in so many directions that they run the risk of not being successful in any. So probably the number one, essential step, I would say, is choose your primary goal. Don't try and do everything at once. Just figure out what is the number one thing we want to achieve from this. Focus on that initially. Achieve your degree of success, whatever. Hopefully you should have set a metric and defined what you consider success before you even start the project. And then once you've achieved that element of success, that measurement, then predefined measurement, then go to the next phase, which perhaps. So usually, for example, you may start off with member-to-member discussions, collaboration, ideation and sharing, that sort of thing. But then maybe phase two would be to support your chapters and can have more control over your branding by providing communities for each of the chapters, and the community might have a website and all of the other typical stuff. And then maybe phase three might be mentoring or learning or advocacy or something like that. But each organization, they have different priorities, and we've certainly had many organizations come to us where their top priority is to extend the value of the learning opportunities that they provide. Right, whether it's in-person courses or webinars or whatever else. And so community is a natural extension of that, because it's not just an association, which is a group of people with a common interest, but it's a subset of that association with an even more defined common interest related to the educational experience that they're trying to focus on.
And in your experience, when you're getting started, is there any magic number, that you see consistently across organizations that they need to have, at least X number of people in there engaging at some level if they're really going to get the thing off the ground?
Well, we're just about to release our second annual report with Marketing General that we contracted with Marketing General to analyze our anonymized engagement data to figure out kind of, what the best success metrics are throughout. And what we found was size of the organization is a huge element in terms of success. And arguably, you'd think that the larger organization, the more likely people are going to have to converse. The more chance they're going to have to converse. We actually found when you normalize the data and look at the engagement levels, smaller organizations tend to score much better than larger organizations. And I'll give you an example. The Alliance of ACA, I can't remember what it stands for. Anyway, this is an organization of financial professionals, and they have 400 members. And last year alone, they generated 15,000 discussion messages.
Wow.
I mean, it was insane, right? But yet, you look at a huge organization, for example, and I'm kind of making the number up because I can't remember off the top of my head, but like Sherm, for example, over 100,000 members, and they're doing pretty well, but they're actually probably generating about 30,000 messages a year. And so, while on the theme of it, on the face of it, they're doing better than the smaller org. But when you look at the percentage of members that are contributing and you factor in those ratios, the smaller organization is doing so much better.
Right.
So, now that's not to say large organizations can't achieve the same success, but there's the notion of smaller organizations. For smaller organizations, it's easier to generate a deeper sense of community, and the more of a sense of community there is for the members, the more likely they are and the more comfortable they are with engaging with each other in an asynchronous environment.
That's interesting, and I guess an extension of that might be that if you are a larger organization, you need to kind of find out where your passionate niches are to really spark some conversation. But I know at the same time, because one of the things I wanted to talk about was the longer term success for communities, and I know one of the things you caution against is not over segmenting, not cutting things down too much into smaller groups. Can you talk a little bit about that and just in general what it takes over the long term to ensure that a community is going to sustain and be successful?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there about not over-segmenting, and there's always exceptions to this. Like if you already have a successful listserv and you're migrating, from a listserv over to a community platform, then that would be an exception. But if you've never had any sort of, member-to-member online collaboration, and let's say that you've got 10,000 members and you've got 10 core industry segments, and the natural inclination is to launch with a community for each of the segments. But we see that that's a recipe for failure. And think of launching a community. The evolution of a community is like the evolution of an association. When the association first started, it started typically with just a few people with a common interest, and that grew and grew. And eventually, when you get critical mass, you start identifying segments of this, what became a membership, with different interests, like sub-interests from the broader organization. And so the point being, an association, when it's formed, they don't launch with interest groups from day one. And the same is true with the community. You launch the broader community, you build critical mass, you make it self-sustaining so there's not a huge amount of staff work involved. And then, 6 months after the launch or whatever, when you see a huge percentage of the discussions are focused on one of the interest areas, that's when, you can make a more informed decision about whether you want to create these subgroups or sub-communities. And you don't do them all at once. You'll do them as you know that each one has got a good chance of success.
Right.
So that's probably, start simple, and also keep in mind that to successfully launch one community, on average, and there's a huge variance with this, but let's say that it takes 40 hours worth of staff time over perhaps a 2-month period, right? Well, there isn't that much economy of scale, and if you have to launch 10 communities, then that will be essentially 10 times 40 hours, right? So there's a huge amount of work if you're going to do it successfully to the point where it's self-sustaining and every day there's conversations going on.
Right, right. Well, and I know at this point you've worked with a wide range of organizations. Are there, some stars out there from your perspective who have just done a great job of launching and sustaining a community over time?
Yeah, I mean, there's too many to count, to be honest with you. But if I just take a few that have launched maybe in the last couple of months, keep in mind we have over like 600 organizations. But if we, for example, SAE, right, the SAE International, which is the Society of Automotive Engineering, although now they're just called SAE, I think they have about 45,000 members. And in their first 3 months, they didn't auto-subscribe everybody, but in their first 3 months, they generated 800 or so organic posts. The look and the feel of the website is great, and that's connection.sae.org is the URL. Another one that springs to mind, the Radiologic Technologists, ASRT, the American Society of Radiologic, I can never say the word, technologists. Their URL is community.asrt.org. They launched July the 6th, and within 2.5 months, it generated over 4,000 messages. Wow. with an additional 500 direct replies to the sender, which is also measurable as well. But that sounds a lot, but they also have 150,000 plus thousand members, of which 135,000 are subscribed to at least one community.
Wow. Okay.
They were absolutely meticulous in their implementation process, so they followed pretty much all of our recommendations and best practices, and the results really speak for themselves. And one more that I'll give a shout out to that launched just a month or two ago was AAPA, the American Academy of Physician Assistants. Their URL is huddle.aapa.org. And they came with an ambitious plan where they wanted to launch within a month of signing the contract, which, is a little bit aggressive if you're going to do it right. But boy, did they really, they came through with everything. And even came through with a plan B, right? Understanding that it just may not be possible. But yeah, they launched with, everything came through with plan A, 50,000 members. And within the first, 2 months or so, they generated well over 1,000 unique discussions. So,
wow,
again, great looking website and, very successful from their perspective, especially, as they've experienced a decline in a downturn retention. So they're looking to turn that around, which I'm positive they will do.
Yeah.
Partly as a result of this.
Well, that's good. Those are some great examples, and we'll be sure to put the links you mentioned into the show notes for the podcast, so that's easy for folks to click on and at least get an outside view. I assume they can't necessarily get into these communities, but kind of get a sense of it at least. I'd love to talk a little bit about what's actually going on in these communities, and of course, this is the Leading Learning podcast, and Tagoras, my company is all about learning, social learning being a huge component of that. So I'd love to get your perspective on the role of learning and knowledge sharing as part of how a community develops successfully, and what organizations can do to help promote the kind of knowledge sharing and learning that's going to make the community valuable.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting area, and it's an area that I am absolutely fascinated about, and I've done a lot of work with. But essentially, there are so many different strategies you can take around social learning. But I'll give you a couple of and every one depends on what the organization's trying to achieve, what their current learning structure is. For example, some organizations just have their annual conference and their webinar, right? But their conference, they might have like hundreds of sessions or thousands of poster sessions or whatever it is. So the strategy for that sort of environment would be entirely different from an organization that perhaps has, a 2-day class that they run once a month on different topics, for example. So you really got to kind of factor that in. And we have essentially, a best practice solution for any possible scenario you could you could come up with, I think. Probably the most interesting in my mind are organizations that have the in-person class and they're looking to extend the value. And that's where you come in with this blended learning solution where, and this has obviously become much more popular in recent years, where, you have perhaps either an in-person event or perhaps some live conference calls or, something that's more of a synchronous, conversation. But and the strategy is similar, whether it's phone calls or in-person events, but let's just say that you have a 2-day course, right, and I'll think of my, when I was working at RIMS, so 2 days course on workers' compensation, right, just which is one of the risk management topics. So in that scenario, you would integrate with the registration system, which is obviously usually the AMS, but it could also be some LMS platform as well. Depending, the integration is a big factor on where you integrate and how you integrate. But let's assume, just for argument's sake, that it's in the core CRM, right, or whatever it is. As people register, they're automatically added to a community, and the community is automatically created for that particular instance of a course. Keep in mind that workers' comp, in this example, the same course runs 10 times a year, right? So each instance of the course is its own community. And the idea is that once you've got critical mass, in other words, once you've got a certain number of people registered, or it could be a certain number of days before the event starts, and we recommend a combination. So let's say that there's 30 people in the course. Once you've reached 15 registrants and it's 3 weeks before the 3 weeks before the actual course starts, then then you would actually set up the automation rules and figure out, all right, we want everybody to introduce themselves as part of their pre-event, pre-in-person experience. So in other words, the idea is you get people to bond and connect and get to know each other. And typically you ask them to answer like 3 simple questions. They'll have a profile, a completed profile attached as well. And they post them to the community. Everybody gets to see who else is attending the course in advance. So they've got a better idea of the sort of questions they're going to have for each other and make that in-person networking experience more valuable. Then they have the course. The instructor, needs to be kind of trained and in order to get them to share their notes and ask questions and create a back channel conversation during the course. And then after the course, the idea is that you extend that conversation, and in a few really great cases I've seen, the instructor has actually gone to the class afterwards via the community and asked them, all right, what have you done? What have you implemented that you learned in the class? Have you had any challenges? In other words, the instructor tries to hold them accountable for a little bit.
Right.
And extend the conversation. And usually with a particular class, the community would run from maybe a month before the class starts to about 2 or 3 months after, but it can go on forever. So that's just one example. And then the other one is, well, what about everybody that's completed and passed the course? And then you have the ability to create alumni groups for everybody with that particular interest that's gone through that training. And there's a whole strategy around that as well. So, and so that's kind of a more involved approach, but then the simpler one is, let's just say I've got a webinar, right? Well, you can use a community that's that most closely matches that webinar topic, and then have the presenter, the expert for that community, available and agree to answer questions about the topic over the next couple of days after the webinar has been given.
Right. And I think it's interesting. I've noticed a lot out in the more sort of, I guess I'll characterize it as the entrepreneurial world, that this whole idea of having membership sites, which are essentially learning communities. They usually have some training and high value content in them, and you get access to some sort of expert who's behind it. That's a big business model right now, and in fact, there are companies out there like Copyblogger that have created whole platforms that really are geared to these sort of for-profit type membership sites. Do you ever see organizations, I'm thinking trade and professional type associations, offering community as a product, that it's not just a member benefit, but something they charge for separately or offer at a premium level or that sort of thing? Do you see any traction for that kind of model in the association world?
Frankly, most times I've seen something like that, it's failed. We've had a few organizations have had a great idea, a community doesn't exist for this particular, area of interest or expertise or something, and they are convinced that a community would be a great solution with the idea of monetizing it once they've got critical mass. It's very, very difficult to make a model like that work. The ones that I've seen that are most closely matched that have been more successful are, for example, when you tie a community around an educational offering, right, and you have some valuable content that people are more interested in paying for the valuable content, as long as you've got a differentiator from all the free stuff that's out there, than they are for paying for a community. But if you provide valuable content like webinars, podcasts, that sort of thing, and then attach community to it as a value add, then that's how you can make the community successful, and then you can turn it around, and then people will eventually pay for access to the community, because it's like it's like an association, it's like a member benefit.
Right.
But it's very difficult if you just want to create a community product from the get-go with nothing that's going to be the hook.
Right. No, I can see that connection between the content and the community is essential. So as we're winding down here, I've got a couple more questions I want to ask you, and one of them is, you're obviously immersed in this stuff on a day-to-day basis and are a thought leader yourself. So what do you see as the most important trends or innovations that are on the horizon for online communities?
Yeah, I'd actually defer to the Community Roundtable, which is kind of the industry-leading organization for community managers. They've done a lot of research around what makes a successful community, and one of the things they published was the Community Roundtable's maturity model. And it's a way of evaluating how mature are you as an organization with respect to leveraging community. And it's a fascinating model, but interestingly, when we did our benchmark study for our 600 or so organizations, we asked a question. We asked them to self-judge where they are on the maturity model. And most of them, I'd say the average is, there was 4 stages within the maturity model. The first stage is more of an ad hoc kind of just wing it approach. Stage 4, which is the most involved, that's when the organization is fully immersed every and any aspect of the organization with its community. And we see that the average organization is probably at stage 2. So I think that even though there's a lot of traction around communities, there's still there's massive room for improvement in terms of fully leveraging community and just creating a fantastic experience for the members, which of course will result, and we know from the data, it results in much greater member satisfaction and significantly improved member retention as well. So I think that, I guess in terms of the trends, just maturing the use of an association's community.
Well, great. This has been a great conversation. One thing we do always like to ask a guest on Leading Learning before we part ways, though we are obviously very focused on lifelong learning. And so it'd be great to hear from you, what your own practices are when it comes to lifelong learning. What kind of habits do you have? And maybe most pointedly, just given who you are there particular communities, you look to support you in your lifelong learning?
Yeah, so, it's interesting because I had this whole conversation with somebody the other day, and we were talking about ASAE and their communities. Of course, is powered by Higher Logic, but and there was a whole conversation going on around whether the the contributors to the communities should be given CE credits. And that started, I mean, that's a whole debate in itself, and there's pros and cons, and it's very controversial, but it's a provocative discussion in itself. But that does tie in with the value of communities and the discussions that members have with each other. And the fact is that every day we're learning from what other people are posting. And yes, there's some posts that just are nonsense and they, perhaps don't give us much value. But we self-select and we pick the ones that we're interested in and we read, and we're learning continuously. And I think that people do underestimate how much power and how much of a learning experience is involved with, what we've traditionally just called lurking. And so, from my perspective, I think, yes, I get the more formal education from, like conferences and going to attending sessions and things like that. In my case, I often go to ASA ones. I think they're really valuable. The Great Ideas or the Digital Now conference and things like that. But I think I get even more value from the communities of which I belong, where social learning is in full effect in its elements, but we just perhaps have not recognized it as a way of learning, but yet it's there and we do it every day. In my case, the Community Roundtable is phenomenal, and so is ASA. It's incredibly valuable. It's something I commit to every day. I just skim through the subject lines, but if there's something I'm interested, I look at it then, or I look at it a little bit later. If not, I just delete the thread and I go on. But every couple of days, something's there that grabs my interest, and usually I learn something from it.
Well, great. I know my own experiences with lifelong learning are very similar. Often you're engaged in that social learning. You don't even know you're doing it, but it's incredibly valuable. And if it disappears at any point, you suddenly realize you're missing out on some of the best sources of learning that you've had.
Yeah, and just on that note, you have certain people that are much better learning in a classroom, right, than taking an online course. I'm one of those people. I'm terrible at taking online courses. I get distracted. And I just, I have a hard time completing them because I'm just so busy doing other stuff. So I have to have that in-person, which is why I like conferences where you sessions and you're very immersed in it. But the fact is, every day I am learning in an asynchronous environment from my peers, from what other people have taken the time to contribute and discuss. So, yeah, it's even if you're more like myself, an in-classroom person, there's definitely an opportunity to learn in using other mediums.
Well, I certainly could not agree more. So, Andy, just to finish up here, what's the best way for anyone who's listening to connect with you, to find out more about you, to find out more about Higher Logic?
Just go to higherlogic.com. You'll see a contact us link in the corner, or if you want to look at my profile specifically, it's higherlogic.com/Andy Steggles.
Great. And I'm assuming people can connect with you on Twitter and places like that as well. Is that
Yeah. Or I say this again, pretty old school, but just Andy@higherlogic.com. Feel free to email me. I love hearing from people that are interested in community engagement and learning.
Well, great. Well, Andy, thanks so much for taking the time to talk today.
My pleasure. Cheers.
So that's the interview with Andy Steggles. To get show notes for this episode, go to leadinglearning.com/episode 10, the word episode, the number 10. And while you're there, you'll also see various options for subscribing to the podcast. And if you haven't done that yet, and if you're enjoying listening to it, if you're getting value out of it, we would be very happy to have you subscribe.
We'd also be truly grateful if you would take a minute to give us a rating on iTunes. Ratings are very important over there, both to help people find the podcast and, of course, just to be motivating to us and make sure that we'll continue doing this on a week-to-week basis. To do that, all you have to do is go to leadinglearning.com/iTunes.
And we also hope that you'll consider telling others about the podcast. You can send out a tweet by going to leadinglearning.com/share. That'll auto-populate a tweet that you can send out. But if you're not on Twitter much, you can also just take that text and take it to your social network of choice and post it there.
And that does it for this episode of the Leading Learning Podcast. We'll see you next time.